A stranger can get you to agree to something large by first getting you to agree to something small, and neither of you has to notice the moment it happened. This is not persuasion in the sense of changing what you believe. It is persuasion that skips belief altogether and goes straight to behavior, and it works on careful, intelligent people, exactly as well as it works on anyone else. Some of what follows will feel obvious once it is named, the kind of thing you always sort of knew, and never quite had words for. Some of it will not feel obvious at all, because it was built specifically not to be noticed, tested and refined by people whose entire job was making sure you would not catch it happening. Across the next 2 hours, we will walk through 100 of these small, well-documented mechanisms drawn from psychology, negotiation research, sales training, and the study of coercive relationships. A play from 1938 gave one of them its modern name. A line-drawing experiment from the 1950s revealed how far a crowd can bend a private judgment. A pricing trick used on restaurant menus turns out to share its logic with a pattern that keeps people in relationships they would otherwise leave. None of this is presented as a warning to be afraid of other people. It is presented the way any mechanism deserves to be presented, calmly and in order, because a mechanism you can name is a mechanism you can watch operate on you in real time, and that alone changes what it can do. There is no need to rush through this. Settle into it the way you would a long walk you already know, the shape of unhurried, because the list will still be here an item from now, and an hour from now, waiting exactly where you left it. A waiter who leaves a small mint with the check gets a noticeably larger tip than a waiter who leaves nothing at all, and the customer rarely connects the two. This is reciprocity, one of the oldest wires in the human circuit board, and it is very hard to switch off even once you know it is there. Across human history, the instinct to repay a favor held small groups together. A person who took without ever giving back was a risk to everyone around them, so the discomfort of owing someone became one of the strongest social pressures a person could feel. That discomfort does not check whether the original gift was requested, wanted, or even useful. A stranger presses a small flower into your hand at an airport, a company mails an unsolicited sample, a co-worker does you an unasked favor before a request lands in your inbox, and each time, some part of the ledger in your head quietly opens a debit column with your name on it. Robert Cialdini's research on influence documented this pattern extensively, showing how a genuinely tiny low-cost gift could reliably produce a much larger return favor out of proportion to what was given. The size of the original gift barely matters. What matters is that a gift was given at all, deliberately, right before a request. Charities that include a small item in their mailing see higher response rates than charities that simply ask. Salespeople trained in this principle offer something free early in a conversation, not because it cost them much, but because it opens the account they intend to collect on later. The honest version of reciprocity is simply gratitude, freely given and freely returned, with no ledger at all. The manipulated version always has a ledger, and it is always opened by the person who benefits from your feeling obligated. The debt was never yours to begin with, and it never stops being someone else's to have offered. In a dim London townhouse in a story first staged in 1938, a husband dims the gas lamps each night while searching the attic for hidden jewels, then insists to his wife that the lights have not changed at all, that she is imagining the flicker, that something is simply wrong with her. The play was called Gaslight. It later became 2 feature films, and somewhere in the decades after, its central device stopped being a plot point and became a diagnosis. Gaslighting now describes a specific pattern of behavior, the deliberate, repeated denial of another person's accurate perception of reality, aimed at making that person doubt their own senses, memory, or judgment rather than doubt the person doing the denying. What makes the tactic effective is not any single lie. It is repetition and confidence. A person who says with total certainty that an event did not happen, that a conversation never occurred, that a promise was never made, forces the listener into an uncomfortable choice between 2 possibilities. Either the other person is lying with remarkable calm, or the listener's own memory is failing. Most people, most of the time, choose to doubt themselves first, because doubting a person you trust feels worse than doubting your own recollection of a small detail. Clinicians who study coercive control note that gaslighting rarely arrives as a single dramatic scene. It usually arrives in small doses, over a long stretch of time, each individual denial too minor to fight over, until the accumulated effect is a person who has quietly stopped trusting their own account of their own life. The wife in the original play was, of course, right about the lamps the entire time. She could see the light change. The only thing she had lost was permission to believe what she saw. Confront someone directly with something they did, and watch closely what happens in the next 10 seconds. In a striking number of cases, researcher Jennifer Freyd observed, the sequence unfolds in almost the same order every time. First comes denial, flat and immediate, often before the accusation has even finished being spoken. Then comes attack, redirected at the accuser rather than the accusation, a sudden inventory of the accuser's own flaws, timing, motives, or history. And finally comes reversal, in which the original wrongdoer recasts themselves as the one truly under attack, wounded, misunderstood, or persecuted by the very act of being confronted. Freyd named this pattern DARVO, an acronym for deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender, and it shows up with remarkable consistency across very different contexts, from small domestic arguments to public accusations that play out in front of an audience. What makes DARVO so effective is not that any one of its 3 moves is especially convincing on its own. It is that the sequence happens fast, and it happens in the emotionally charged moment right after an accusation lands, when the accuser is often too caught off guard by the counterattack to hold their footing. An observer arriving partway through a DARVO exchange frequently comes away with the impression that 2 people are equally upset with each other, each making a claim, each seemingly wounded. The actual asymmetry, who did what to whom, gets lost in the noise of who currently sounds more upset. Recognizing the shape of DARVO does not require reading anyone's mind. It only requires noticing the order events occur in: denial, then counterattack, then a claim of victimhood, arriving in that sequence, right on cue every single time. The pattern is the tell long before any single sentence is. Ask a homeowner to place a small sign in their front window supporting careful driving, and a surprising number will agree without much thought. Return weeks later and ask that same homeowner to allow a much larger, more intrusive sign on their front lawn, and the odds of a yes rise sharply, far more than if you had simply asked for the large sign from a stranger who had never been approached before. This is the foot-in-the-door effect, documented in classic mid-century social psychology research on home compliance requests, and it works because agreeing to a small request quietly changes how a person sees themselves. Once someone has said yes to a modest ask, they begin to think of themselves as the kind of person who helps with this cause, who supports this idea, who says yes to this sort of thing. The second, larger request is no longer being evaluated purely on its own merits. It is being evaluated against a self-image the first request just installed. The tactic scales far beyond lawn signs. A charity asks for a small monthly donation before asking for a larger one-time gift. A salesperson gets a customer to agree to a free consultation before asking for a purchase. A new acquaintance asks for a small piece of information before asking for something more private. Each small yes is, on its own, entirely reasonable, which is exactly what makes the technique so hard to resist. There is rarely a single obviously unreasonable moment to object to. What makes foot in the door different from an honest, gradually escalating request is intent. An honest request escalates because the situation genuinely calls for it. A manipulated one escalates because the first small yes was never really about the sign, the survey, or the favour at all. The door was open before the second request ever arrived. Ask a stranger to volunteer several hours a week for 2 full years working with troubled youth, and almost everyone will refuse. Ask that same stranger, immediately after the refusal, to simply chaperone one afternoon trip, and acceptance rates climb well above what a cold request for the smaller favour alone would produce. This is door in the face, the deliberate mirror image of foot in the door. Where the smaller technique starts modest and builds up, this one starts absurdly large, expects refusal, and then retreats immediately to the real request. The refusal itself does the persuasive work. Having just said no to something enormous, a person often feels a pull to compensate, to prove they are not simply uncooperative, by saying yes to something markedly smaller. The technique depends heavily on contrast rather than on the actual size of either request. A 10-minute favour asked cold might get refused. The same 10-minute favour, asked immediately after a 2-hour favour has been declined, suddenly looks trivial by comparison, even though nothing about the 10 minutes has changed. Negotiators use a version of this constantly, opening with a demand they know will be rejected, purely to make their real target look modest and reasonable once it finally arrives. Street fundraisers, salespeople, and even children negotiating with parents use door in the face instinctively, often without any formal name for what they are doing. The pattern is intuitive enough that people discover it on their own long before a researcher ever writes it down. What makes the two techniques, foot in the door and door in the face, work as a pair is that they exploit the same underlying vulnerability from opposite directions. A person's sense of what counts as reasonable is never fixed. It is set entirely by whatever request came immediately before. The real number was decided long before either request was spoken aloud. A sign reading only 3 left in stock will move more units than the identical product sitting on a fully stocked shelf, even when both signs are describing the exact same warehouse of inventory behind the scenes. Scarcity works because human judgment has never fully separated the availability of a thing from the desirability of it. Across most of human history, a resource that others were competing for really was more valuable because competition was a reliable signal of quality or usefulness. That signal still fires today, even in contexts where the scarcity was manufactured 5 minutes ago by someone typing a number into a website. Hotel booking sites display how many other people are currently looking at the same room. Airlines display how few seats remain at a given fare. Retailers run countdown clocks on sales that quietly relaunch the moment the countdown ends. None of these are illegal, and most of them are not even dishonest in a strict sense, since the number displayed may technically be accurate at that exact moment. What they share is a deliberate emphasis on limitation over quality, betting correctly that a shopper who feels a resource slipping away will decide faster and think less critically than a shopper who feels no such pressure. Researchers studying this effect have found that scarcity framing works even on people who consciously recognize the tactic while it is happening to them, because the emotional response arrives faster than the analytical override. Knowing a lever exists does not disconnect the lever from the machine. The shelf was never actually close to empty. The feeling that it was arrived on its own schedule, and it arrived exactly on time. Ask one group to guess whether the tallest redwood tree in the world is taller or shorter than 1,200 feet, then ask them to guess its actual height. Ask a second group the same question, but replace 1,200 feet with a much smaller number. The two groups' final guesses will land far apart, even though both groups are estimating the exact same tree. This is anchoring, one of the most thoroughly replicated findings to come out of Dan Yule-Amun and Amos Tversky's decades of research on judgment and decision-making. A number introduced early in a decision, even an arbitrary or obviously irrelevant one, exerts a pull on every subsequent estimate, offer, or judgment made afterward, whether or not the person making those later judgments realizes it is happening. Negotiators exploit anchoring by naming a number first, deliberately, because the second party's counteroffer will almost always be calculated relative to that first number rather than independently. A salary offer that opens absurdly low still shifts the eventual settlement lower than it would have landed if the employee had named the first figure instead. A price tag marked as reduced from a much higher original price makes the reduced price feel like a bargain regardless of whether the higher price was ever a real, honestly charged amount. What makes anchoring difficult to resist, even once a person knows about it, is that the pull happens below the level of deliberate reasoning. Simply being warned that an anchor is coming reduces its effect only slightly, and rarely removes it entirely. The room settles around whichever number arrived first, and almost no one in the room chooses to notice. A participant sits in a small group and is shown 2 cards, one with a single line, the other with 3 lines of clearly different lengths, and asks simply to say aloud which of the 3 lines matches the length of the first. The answer is obvious, and yet, in Solomon Ash's now famous line judgment experiments from the 1950s, when every other person in the room, secretly instructed in advance, confidently gave the same wrong answer, a substantial share of real participants abandoned the evidence in front of their own eyes, and repeated the wrong answer too. Ash's studies were designed to isolate one question: how much social pressure does it take to override a plain, unambiguous perception? The answer turned out to be surprisingly little. Participants later interviewed about their choice described real, uncomfortable doubt in the moment, a genuine sense that the group must somehow be seeing something they were not. even when their own eyes told them otherwise. The experiment used strangers with nothing at stake and no relationship to protect, which makes the finding more unsettling, not less. Real social groups carry far higher stakes than a psychology lab: reputation, belonging, employment, family standing. Anyone hoping to steer a group's decision has learned, whether formally or by instinct, that stating a claim with confidence, especially in front of others who might follow along, does more work than the strongest argument delivered to one person alone. This is the engine behind manufactured consensus, staged agreement, and planted opinions in any room where people are watching each other for cues about what to think. The line on the card never changed length. What changed was how many voices in the room were willing to describe it accurately, once one wrong voice had already spoken. Most people, most of the time, would rather be wrong together than right alone. A construction project running badly over budget and years behind schedule often continues anyway, not because anyone still believes it is a good use of money, but because so much money has already gone into it that stopping feels unbearable. Economists call this the sunk cost fallacy, and it shows up in decisions far smaller than any construction project, in relationships, careers, and purchases people know are no longer serving them. The logic of sunk cost is simple once stated plainly. Money, time, or effort already spent is gone regardless of what happens next, and a rational decision about the future should not weigh a cost that cannot be recovered either way. And yet almost no one reasons this cleanly in practice. The pain of admitting that a past investment was wasted feels sharper than the cost of continuing to waste more, so people keep going, hoping the eventual payoff will somehow retroactively justify what has already been lost. Manipulators who understand this pattern do not need to convince a target that a bad deal is good. They only need to get the target invested early, in almost any form: time spent, information shared, a small payment made, an emotional confession offered, because from that point forward the sunk cost fallacy will do a great deal of the persuading on its own. A relationship, a business deal, or a cause that has already consumed years of someone's life becomes far harder to walk away from than the exact same relationship, deal, or cause would have been to refuse on day one. The money already spent cannot be brought back by spending more of it. That fact does not stop being true no matter how much has already gone in. Within days of meeting, a new partner is calling several times a day, naming a shared future in vivid detail, describing the relationship as unlike anything either of them has ever felt, and expressing hurt or confusion at any hint of a slower pace. To the person receiving it, the intensity can feel like an extraordinary stroke of luck, the rare person who simply gets it immediately. Love bombing describes this exact arc, an early flood of attention, affection, and grand declarations, delivered at a pace that outruns any reasonable amount of time two people have actually spent learning about each other. The overwhelming warmth is not evidence of an unusually deep connection. It is, more often, a way of establishing emotional dependency before trust has had any chance to be earned through ordinary means, like consistency over time or behavior tested under mild disagreement. What distinguishes love bombing from simple enthusiasm is what tends to follow it. Relationships that researchers and clinicians describe under this pattern often show a later withdrawal, a cooling of the exact intensity that had been offered so freely at the start, sometimes followed by confusion, blame, or accusations directed at the partner for somehow causing the change. Having already been anchored to that early peak of attention, the person on the receiving end often works hard to recover it, rather than questioning why it arrived so suddenly in the first place. Genuine affection, almost without exception, is able to survive a slower pace. It does not require urgency to prove itself, and it does not treat patience as a betrayal. The warmth that arrives before it has been earned is rarely about how special the moment feels. It is about how fast a foundation can be poured before anyone gets a good look underneath it. Offer a person a choice between a certain small gain and a gamble with a higher expected value, and most will take the safe, smaller gain. Offer that same person a choice between a certain small loss and a gamble with the same higher expected value, framed now as a loss, and the same people remarkably become far more willing to gamble. This asymmetry, first documented in Daniel Khna Munn and A.Y. Mew's TVUski's prospect theory, found that losses are felt roughly twice as intensely as equivalent gains. The number itself is less important than the underlying discovery. The human mind does not treat gains and losses as mirror images, and framing the exact same outcome as one or the other changes the decision that follows. This asymmetry is now built into how choices are presented across advertising, negotiation, and everyday persuasion. A subscription framed as something you will lose if you cancel is more compelling than the identical subscription framed as something you might gain by staying. A limited time offer framed around what you will miss out on outperforms the same offer framed around what you will receive. Insurance, warranties, and countless financial products are marketed almost entirely around the fear of a loss rather than the promise of a gain, because the fear reliably moves more people to act. Manipulators in personal relationships use the same asymmetry, framing a partner's departure as a devastating loss to be avoided rather than a neutral choice to be freely made, precisely because loss lands harder than any equivalent gain ever could. The underlying value of the choice rarely changes at all. Only the frame does, and the frame turns out to be doing almost all the deciding. A subscription service offers two plans: digital access alone at a modest price, or print and digital together at a price only slightly higher. Most customers choose the cheaper digital-only option. Add a third plan, print alone, priced almost the same as the combined print and digital option, and suddenly the combined plan becomes the clear favorite, chosen far more often than before, even though nothing about its actual value has changed. That third option, the print-only plan, was never designed to be chosen. It exists purely to make the combined plan look like an obvious bargain by comparison. This is the decoy effect, and it works by changing the frame of comparison rather than by changing anything about the products actually being compared. Menu designers, retailers, and software companies use decoys constantly, often placing a deliberately unattractive middle-tier option next to a genuinely appealing higher-tier one, betting correctly that shoppers evaluate options relative to each other far more than they evaluate them on independent merit. Very few people sit down and calculate the standalone value of a product. Instead, they scan the available choices and reach for whichever one looks best positioned among its neighbors. What makes the decoy effect difficult to spot in the moment is that it never asks for anything directly. No one is pressured, rushed, or lied to about price. The manipulation happens entirely in the architecture of the choices offered, before the customer even begins comparing. The decoy was placed on the menu to lose. Its only job was making sure something else looked like it had won. A tall, attractive job candidate is rated by interviewers as more competent, more trustworthy, and even more intelligent than an equally qualified candidate who happens to be less conventionally attractive, despite identical resumes and identical answers to every interview question. This is the halo effect, first described in early 20th century psychological research on how a single strong positive impression bleeds outward into completely unrelated judgments about a person. Once someone is perceived favorably in one dimension, whether that dimension is looks, charisma, confidence, or even just a firm handshake, other qualities get assumed favorably as well, often with no supporting evidence at all. This bleed is exploited constantly and often deliberately. A confident, well-dressed speaker is believed more readily than an equally accurate but nervous, plainly dressed one, regardless of what either actually says. A celebrity endorsement transfers a sense of trustworthiness onto a product with which the celebrity has no actual expertise. A person who is simply likable in conversation is far more readily believed about facts entirely unrelated to their likability. Salespeople, con artists, and public figures alike learn, whether through training or simple trial and error, that establishing one strong, favorable impression early in an interaction pays dividends across every claim made afterward. Once the halo is in place, a listener's critical scrutiny relaxes automatically, without any conscious decision to relax it. The halo effect does not require deception about the specific trait creating the glow. The attractive candidate really was attractive. What the halo adds, quietly and without permission, is everything else. A disagreement between two people quietly stalls, and rather than resolving it directly, one of them brings a third person into it, a mutual friend, a parent, a co-worker, relaying a version of the conflict, sometimes accurately and sometimes not, and inviting that third person to weigh in or take a side. This is triangulation, a well-documented pattern in family and relationship dynamics in which a two-person conflict is deliberately routed through a third party rather than addressed between the original two people. The tactic can serve several purposes at once. It can recruit an ally to pressure the other party. It can allow the person doing the triangulating to control the narrative, before the other side gets a chance to speak for themselves. and it can simply avoid the discomfort of a direct confrontation while still applying pressure indirectly. Triangulation shows up frequently in workplaces, where a manager might relay criticism through a colleague rather than delivering it directly, and in families, where a parent might speak to a child through another sibling rather than addressing the child themselves. In romantic relationships, one partner comparing the other unfavorably to an ex, a friend, or an idealized alternative is a subtler version of the same triangulating structure, introducing a third presence into a conversation that should only involve two people. What makes triangulation effective is that it is genuinely difficult to argue against a version of events relayed secondhand. The absent third party cannot ask clarifying questions, cannot hear tone or context, and often ends up with a distorted account that favors whoever brought them in. The conflict was never actually between three people. It only started to look that way once one side decided a direct conversation was not the version they wanted told. Across a negotiating table, one party leans slightly forward, and moments later, without either person consciously deciding it, the other leans forward too. One crosses an arm, and soon the other does as well. Neither party is aware this is happening, and yet by the end of the meeting, they report liking and trusting each other noticeably more than a matched pair who never fell into this rhythm. This is mirroring, a documented rapport-building technique in which one person subtly matches another's posture, gestures, tone, and pace. Humans do this naturally and unconsciously with people they already feel close to, which means the reverse also holds. Deliberately mirroring a stranger creates a felt sense of closeness even before any real closeness has been earned. Sales and negotiation training programs teach mirroring explicitly, instructing trainees to subtly match a counterpart's speaking pace, posture, and even breathing rhythm, because the resulting sense of rapport measurably increases trust, likability, and eventual agreement. The technique works precisely because it operates below conscious notice. A person on the receiving end of skilled mirroring rarely thinks, "This person is copying my posture." They simply feel, without quite knowing why, that this conversation is going unusually well. Mirroring differs from ordinary rapport in one important way. Genuine rapport tends to be mutual and organic, arising from both people relaxing into each other's presence. Deliberate mirroring is one-directional and calculated, performed by someone who has learned exactly which cues to copy and precisely when to introduce a small deliberate mismatch to test whether the other person notices at all. The warmth in the room can be entirely real to totally manufactured by the person producing it. A stranger approaches at a party and offers an odd, backhanded observation, something like noting that you are surprisingly confident for someone dressed so plainly, delivered with a smile, in a tone that could pass for playful. The remark lands strangely, half a compliment and half an insult, and against most people's better judgment, it tends to draw attention rather than repel it. This is negging, a manipulation tactic documented in pickup artist literature, and later studied more broadly as a form of confidence destabilization. The mixed signal, part flattery and part put down, is deliberately engineered to be more disorienting than either a clean compliment or a clean insult would be on its own. A person on the receiving end often finds themselves unexpectedly seeking approval or clarification from exactly the person who just unsettled them, which is precisely the reaction the tactic is designed to produce. What makes negging effective, when it works at all, is the ambiguity itself. A straightforward insult would simply be rejected or reciprocated. A straightforward compliment would be pleasant but forgettable. The combination creates a small nagging quest for and cannot easily resolve, and people have a documented tendency to keep engaging with unresolved social puzzles rather than walking away from them. The tactic works far less reliably on people with a stable sense of their own worth, because the destabilization it depends on has nowhere solid to land. It relies entirely on manufacturing a small crack of doubt in someone who did not have one moments earlier. A genuine compliment never needs a hook. The hook is the entire reason this one was built with one. A parent tells a grown child, quietly and often, about everything given up to raise them, the sacrifices made, the opportunities forgone, and each mention, whether intended this way or not, arrives with an unspoken invoice attached. After everything I did for you, surely you can do this one thing for me. Guilt-tripping recruits the target's own conscience as the enforcement mechanism, which is what makes it more durable than a direct demand. a direct demand can simply be refused. A demand wrapped in guilt reframes refusal itself as evidence of ingratitude or selfishness, so that saying no carries a moral cost the target did not sign up for. The tactic differs meaningfully from a legitimate appeal to someone's conscience. An honest appeal names a real, specific harm and leaves the listener free to weigh it fairly. A guilt trip, by contrast, tends to escalate in proportion to resistance, growing more dramatic the more the target hesitates, and often invokes unrelated past sacrifices that have little bearing on the present request. The emotional intensity is calibrated to the target's resistance, not to the actual stakes of the request itself. Relationship researchers who study this pattern note that habitual guilt tripping tends to produce compliance without goodwill, meaning the target eventually does what is asked but with resentment accumulating quietly underneath, which is a poor foundation for any relationship meant to last. The debt being collected was never actually incurred through any agreement. It was simply declared to exist, and declared persuasively enough that questioning it felt like the greater offense. An employee is told that a promotion will follow once a specific project is finished. The project finishes successfully and the promotion is postponed, now contingent on a second project, unnamed until this exact moment. The pattern repeats, each time with a plausible new condition, and each time the employee finds themselves working just as hard, chasing a finish line that was never actually fixed in place. Moving the goalposts describes exactly this, a standard that shifts each time it is met, so that the person striving toward it never actually arrives, no matter how completely they satisfy every stated condition. In relationships, this might look like a partner promising affection, or trust once a particular behavior changes, only to introduce a new demand the moment the old one is fulfilled. In workplaces, it might look like performance targets that quietly rise every time an employee reaches them. What makes this tactic difficult to challenge in the moment is that each individual goalpost considered alone often looks reasonable. It is only in retrospect, laid end to end, that the pattern of perpetual relocation becomes visible. A person subjected to this for long enough often concludes that the problem must be their own effort, since they can point to no single unreasonable demand, rather than recognizing that the finish line itself was the actual obstacle. The honest version of a standard is fixed before the effort begins, and satisfied once the effort meets it. A moving goalpost was never meant to be reached. Its entire function is the reaching itself, kept going indefinitely. After a disagreement, one partner stops responding entirely, not for an hour to cool down, but for days, refusing texts, calls, and any acknowledgement that the other person exists, while offering no explanation for either the silence or its eventual end. Ordinary silence, taken to collect one's thoughts before continuing a difficult conversation, is a healthy and well-documented part of conflict resolution. The silent treatment, by contrast, is engineered specifically to produce distress in the other person, and its purpose is punishment or control rather than reflection. Researchers studying this pattern distinguish the two by looking at duration, intent, and resolution. A healthy pause has a clear endpoint and returns to the conversation once emotions settle. A punitive silence has no announced endpoint at all and often ends abruptly, on the silent partner's own schedule, without acknowledgement of the distress it caused. The tactic is effective because human beings are deeply wired for social connection, and the sudden, unexplained withdrawal of that connection produces genuine anxiety, not unlike a physical injury in the systems the brain uses to register it. A target of the silent treatment often becomes desperate to restore contact, apologizing for things they may not believe they did wrong, simply to end the discomfort of being cut off. What makes the silent treatment corrosive over time, according to relationship researchers, is that it teaches the recipient that conflict resolution is unpredictable and controlled entirely by the other person's willingness to speak again, rather than by anything the recipient can do or say. The quiet in the room was never actually out needing space. It was about how loudly that quiet could be made to hurt. A coworker mentions, almost in passing, how impressed they have always been by your work ethic, your patience, your generosity with your time, and moments later asks for a favor that will consume a significant chunk of your weekend. The compliment and the request arrive so close together that separating them in the moment feels almost rude. This is ingratiation, flattery deployed with a specific purpose attached, rather than offered freely with nothing expected in return. Studies on compliance and persuasion have found that a compliment delivered immediately before a request measurably increases the odds the request is granted, and the effect holds even when the listener consciously suspects the flattery might be strategic. What distinguishes ingratiation from an honest compliment is not the content of the praise itself, which may even be entirely true, but its placement and timing. Genuine appreciation tends to arrive with no request attached at all, or arrives well after any favour has already been settled, disconnected from any transaction. Ingratiation is calibrated for maximum effect at the precise moment a decision is about to be made, and it tends to target exactly the trait most relevant to the upcoming ask. Generosity right before a request for money, competence right before a request for extra work, patience right before a request that will test it. Salespeople are trained explicitly in this technique, offered as an easy, low-cost way to raise a customer's receptiveness before the actual pitch begins. The compliment costs the salesperson nothing and often returns far more than its apparent size would suggest. The praise may have been entirely accurate. Its accuracy was never really the point of its timing. A person convinced of a particular political opinion, dietary choice, or personal habit tends to assume without checking that a much larger share of other people privately agree with them than actually do. This overestimation has a name in psychological research, the false consensus effect, and it is remarkably consistent across very different beliefs and populations. The effect exists partly because people surround themselves, often without noticing, with others who already share their views, which creates a distorted local sample that gets mistaken for a representative one. But manipulators exploit the effect far more directly, simply asserting that a consensus already exists, without offering any actual evidence, and letting the listener's own imagined crowd fill in the gap. A salesperson claiming that everyone is switching to a particular product leans on this effect. A person in an argument claiming that everyone agrees with them leans on it too. Even the simple phrase, "most people think," deployed without any actual data behind it, borrows the persuasive weight of an assumed majority the speaker has done nothing to establish. What makes this tactic effective is that checking a claimed consensus is often more effort than simply accepting it, especially in a fast-moving conversation. Listeners rarely stop to ask for the actual survey, and the assertion of agreement does most of its persuasive work simply by being stated with confidence. The crowd invoked in the claim was never actually consulted. It was imagined into existence for exactly as long as the sentence describing it lasted. An actor wearing a white lab coat, introduced only as a doctor, is far more likely to be obeyed and believed by strangers on the street than the same actor making the exact same claims dressed in ordinary clothes. The coat itself carries no medical training. It carries a symbol, and the symbol does an enormous share of the persuading before a single fact is checked. Appeals to authority work whether or not the underlying authority is genuine, because most people, most of the time, do not have the time, expertise, or inclination to verify a credential on the spot. A uniform, a title, a framed certificate on a wall, a confident use of technical jargon, all function as shortcuts that signal expertise without actually demonstrating it, and human judgment reliably treats the shortcut as though it were the real thing. Advertising exploits this constantly, presenting actors in medical settings or borrowing scientific-sounding language to lend a product a credibility it has not earned through actual evidence. Scammers impersonate officials, banks, or government agencies precisely because the borrowed authority of the role makes their demands feel legitimate before any scrutiny has a chance to catch up. Even within genuine expertise, name-dropping credentials irrelevant to the actual claim being made, a medical degree cited in support of a financial opinion, for instance, borrows authority from one domain to cover a claim in an entirely different one. Genuine expertise can typically survive being questioned because it is backed by evidence that holds up under scrutiny. Borrowed authority tends to rely on the scrutiny never actually arriving. The coat was real. The doctor wearing it, in this particular scene, never was. A website displays a countdown clock ticking down toward the end of a special discount, and the moment it reaches 0, the page quietly resets, offering the exact same discount under a fresh, identical countdown. Almost no one who buys under the pressure of that clock ever checks whether it was telling the truth. Artificial urgency manufactures a deadline that does not correspond to any real underlying scarcity. purely to compress the decision-making window before a buyer has time to deliberate, compare alternatives, or simply sleep on it. Genuine deadlines exist too, of course, but the manufactured version borrows their psychological weight without any of the actual constraint behind it. Research on decision-making under time pressure has found that rushed decisions tend to rely more heavily on emotional response and less on careful comparison, which is precisely the trade-off an artificial deadline is designed to produce. A shopper given unlimited time to consider a purchase is far more likely to notice a better alternative, a hidden cost, or simply that the item was not something they actually needed. A shopper given 10 minutes rarely gets that far. The tactic appears far beyond retail. A recruiter claiming an offer will expire within hours. A suitor insisting a decision about the relationship must be made immediately. A scammer demanding urgent action to avoid an invented penalty. All borrow the same underlying pressure, betting that urgency will crowd out the careful thinking that would otherwise expose the trick. The clock was never actually running out. It was simply designed to look for exactly as long as it needed to, like it was. A person scrolling through photos of a friend's vacation feels a sharp, specific discomfort that has little to do with wanting to visit that particular destination themselves. The discomfort is about being left out of an experience others are having, distinct from any genuine desire for the experience itself, and researchers studying this reaction have found it behaves differently from ordinary wanting. Fear of missing out, commonly shortened to FOHMO, is driven primarily by social comparison rather than by the intrinsic appeal of whatever is being missed. This distinction matters because it means the fear can be manufactured entirely through visibility rather than through improving the actual thing on offer. A product does not need to become more useful to trigger this fear. It only needs to appear convincingly to be something other people already have and are enjoying. Social media platforms are structured in ways that amplify this effect by default, surfacing curated highlights of other people's lives at a volume no earlier generation ever had to process. Marketers have learned to lean on the same mechanism directly, framing products around exclusivity and social visibility, limited drops, invite-only access, member-only pricing, precisely because these framings trigger the fear of exclusion more reliably than a straightforward pitch about the product's actual features ever could. What makes FOHMO especially resistant to reasoning is that it rarely announces itself as fear. It arrives disguised as simple desire, and by the time a person recognizes the discomfort for what it actually is, a decision has often already been made in its shadow. The experience being missed was rarely as good as its absence made it feel. An advertisement promises a remarkably low price on a popular item, draws a customer into the store, and once there, the customer learns the advertised item is unavailable, but a similar item at a considerably higher price is readily in stock. Having already made the trip, already imagined owning the product, already committed mentally to the purchase, many customers buy the substitute rather than walking away. Bait and switch is one of the oldest documented sales tactics, and its effectiveness rests almost entirely on timing. The switch never happens before the customer has committed to something, only after. Backing out at that point carries a real psychological cost, the sunk of the trip, the sunk hope of the anticipated purchase, and abandoning the deal entirely feels like forfeiting all of it for nothing. The tactic exists in forms well beyond retail. A job posting might advertise generous terms that quietly shrink once an offer letter is finally issued. A contractor might quote an attractive initial price, then discover a string of necessary additions once the customer is already committed and mid-project. A romantic partner might present an appealing version of themselves during early courtship, only to reveal a considerably different set of expectations once the relationship feels established. Consumer protection researchers note that bait and switch depends on a very specific psychological window, the gap between commitment and completion, during which a person has already invested enough to feel reluctant to walk away, but has not yet received enough to feel satisfied. Anyone using the tactic deliberately positions the switch precisely inside that gap. The original price was never actually the offer. It was only ever the door. A car buyer agrees to a strikingly low price, feeling like they have gotten an unusually good deal, and sits down to finalize the paperwork. One small fee is added for an administrative charge. Another is added for a required inspection. A third is added for a feature the buyer is told cannot legally be removed. Each addition is modest on its own, and by the time the buyer signs, the total has crept back up to something close to what a fair price would have been from the start. But the buyer, having already agreed to the deal in principle, rarely walks away over any single small increase. This is lowballing, and it leans on the same underlying psychology as sunk cost, applied specifically to the moment right before a purchase closes. Once a buyer has mentally committed to a deal, agreed to it verbally, told friends about it, or simply invested the time of negotiating it, backing out over an added fee feels disproportionately costly compared to simply accepting the fee and moving forward. Sales trainers have documented this pattern extensively in the car industry, where the technique has a long and well-studied history, but it appears anywhere a buyer's early commitment can be leveraged into later concessions. Home renovation contracts, service agreements, even romantic relationships where an initial low-effort promise gradually expands into a much larger set of unstated expectations once the other person feels already committed. What makes lowballing difficult to resist in the moment is that no single addition, considered alone, feels worth abandoning an otherwise good deal over. The technique counts on exactly that reasoning, repeated one small addition at a time. The deal that finally gets signed was rarely the deal that was actually agreed to. A telemarketer finishes a pitch and, right before the customer can decline, adds that the deal also includes a second item at no extra charge, thrown in specifically for this call. Studies on this exact sequence have found that adding an unexpected bonus at that precise moment, immediately before the customer answers, measurably raises the odds of a yes, more than offering the same bonus at any other point in the conversation. The technique works by triggering a small version of the same reciprocity instinct behind unsolicited gifts, but compressed into a single moment of decision. The added item was never requested, and its value may be modest, but its timing matters enormously. Arriving in the instant before a decision is made, it reframes the entire offer as suddenly richer than it was seconds earlier, without actually changing the underlying price of the item the customer originally considered. Researchers studying this pattern have also found that the specific framing of the addition, offered only right now, or included for this call only, adds a secondary layer of manufactured urgency on top of the reciprocity effect, compounding the pressure to decide quickly rather than think it through. What separates this technique from an honest bundled discount, offered transparently as part of the original pitch, is precisely its placement at the very last second before a decision. A genuine bundle is priced and presented as a package from the start. This tactic reserves its extra element specifically for the moment resistance is highest, betting that a small unexpected sweetener will tip a wavering customer over the edge. The extra item was never really the point of the call. It only ever needed to arrive at the right second. A person facing a reasonable request, one that would ordinarily be easy to grant or easy to decline without much friction, instead responds with an extended account of their own hardships, past disappointments and present struggles, none of it strictly relevant to the request at hand, but delivered in a way that makes refusal feel cruel by comparison. Pity plays work because refusing someone who is visibly suffering triggers a genuine, deeply rooted discomfort, one that evolved to help people recognize and respond to real need. The tactic hijacks that discomfort by presenting suffering, whether genuine, exaggerated, or entirely unrelated to the request, at precisely the moment a decision needs to be made, so that the target's compassion gets redirected toward compliance rather than toward the actual hardship being described. What distinguishes a manipulative pity play from a genuine appeal for help is proportion and pattern. A genuine need is usually specific, is not deployed selectively only when convenient, and does not escalate the moment it fails to produce the desired result. A manufactured pity play, by contrast, often arrives disproportionately large relative to whatever small request is actually on the table, and it tends to appear reliably at exactly the moments a boundary is being set, and far less reliably at other times. Family and workplace researchers who study this pattern note that habitual reliance on pity as a persuasion tool tends to erode trust over time, because the people on the receiving end eventually learn to distrust every subsequent claim of genuine hardship, including the real ones. The suffering invoked in the moment may or may not be real. What is rarely in doubt is exactly when it was chosen to be shared. A household task gets assigned, and it gets done badly slowly, or in a way that requires someone else to redo it entirely, repeatedly over months, until the other person simply stops delegating that task at all and quietly absorbs it into their own already full workload. Weaponized incompetence describes exactly this pattern, performing a responsibility poorly enough, often, though not always deliberately, that someone else eventually takes it over entirely, while the person doing the poor performance retains the appearance of having tried, unlike outright refusal, which invites direct conflict and clear accountability. Weaponized incompetence is difficult to call out without sounding unreasonable, since on its surface an effort genuinely was made. Researchers studying household labor division have documented this pattern, showing up disproportionately along familiar lines, with certain tasks consistently and mysteriously performed worse by whichever partner benefits most from not having to do them long term. The pattern rarely announces itself as a strategy, even to the person engaging in it, which is more job than a conscious manipulation would be, harder to confront and harder for either party to name clearly. What separates weaponized incompetence from a genuine skill gap is consistency and convenience. Genuine struggle with a task tend to improve with practice, and does not conveniently apply only to unwanted responsibilities while leaving preferred ones untouched. A pattern of failure that only ever shows up around chores nobody wants to do deserves a second look. The help was technically offered every single time. It simply never quite arrived in a form that anyone could actually rely on. A slot machine pays out unpredictably, sometimes on the first pull, and sometimes not for a long stretch, and this unpredictability, rather than discouraging play, is precisely what keeps people at the machine far longer than a machine that paid out on a fixed, predictable schedule ever would. Intermittent reinforcement, a well-established finding in behavioral research, shows that rewards delivered inconsistently produce behavior that is both stronger and more resistant to stopping than rewards delivered every single time. A behavior reinforced consistently fades quickly once the reward stops. A behavior reinforced unpredictably persists for a remarkably long time even after rewards become rare, because the uncertainty itself keeps the behavior alive on the chance that this next attempt might be the one that pays off. The same mechanism explains why inconsistent affection or approval in a relationship can bind a person more tightly than steady, reliable affection ever could. A partner who is warm sometimes and cold at other times, unpredictably, keeps the other person emotionally engaged in a way a consistently warm or consistently cold partner does not, because the uncertainty itself becomes the thing being chased. Certain video games, social media platforms, and gambling products are deliberately engineered around this exact principle, delivering rewards, likes, matches, wins on unpredictable schedules specifically because unpredictability is more compelling than reliability. What makes intermittent reinforcement particularly hard to walk away from is that it does not feel irrational from the inside. It feels like hope reasonably placed, right up until the pattern is finally seen clearly for what it actually is. The reward was never withheld by accident. Its unpredictability was the entire design. A new romantic interest sends warm, attentive messages for several days, then disappears without explanation for a week, then returns with the same warmth as though nothing happened, never quite escalating into a defined relationship, and never quite ending either. Breadcrumbing describes this exact cycle of intermittent, low-commitment attention, just enough contact to keep hope alive, never enough to constitute an actual relationship. The person on the receiving end is kept in a suspended state, neither confidently pursuing someone else, nor confidently building anything real with this person, because the warm moments, however sparse, keep suggesting that something more substantial might still be coming. What sustains breadcrumbing over time is the same intermittent reinforcement mechanism that keeps a person at a slot machine applied to affection instead of money. Each small crumb of attention, arriving unpredictably, reactivates hope more effectively than either a consistent relationship or a clean total absence would. A consistent partner offers no uncertainty to chase. A total stranger offers nothing to hope for at all. Breadcrumbing occupies the narrow, uncomfortable space between the two, and that space turns out to be remarkably sticky. Relationship researchers distinguish breadcrumbing from a slow, honest courtship by looking at direction rather than pace. A slow, honest courtship, even a cautious one, tends to move steadily toward greater clarity and commitment over time. Breadcrumbing does not move anywhere at all. It simply repeats the same cycle of warmth and withdrawal indefinitely, with no destination it is actually working toward. The crumbs were never a sign that a fuller meal was coming. They were the entire meal, portioned out exactly to keep someone hungry. A partner describes in vivid and specific detail a shared future together, a home, a wedding, a life mapped out years in advance, spoken with such conviction that it feels like evidence of genuine commitment, and yet months and then years pass, and none of the concrete steps toward that future ever actually begin. Future faking substitutes a detailed imagined tomorrow for verifiable action in the present, and it is remarkably effective because human beings tend to treat a vividly described plan as meaningfully similar to an actual commitment, even when no observable behavior has changed to support it. The detail itself does much of the plain-vite skepticism. A specific one, complete with names, dates, or particular details, feels like it must be sincere simply because it took some imagination to produce. What distinguishes future faking from a genuine, if delayed, plan is follow-through. A sincere plan for the future is typically accompanied by small, concrete steps taken in the present, even modest ones, that move steadily toward the stated goal. Future faking, by contrast, tends to remain permanently in the future tense, refreshed with new details whenever the previous version starts to feel stale or gets questioned, but never actually converted into present action. Relationship counselors who work with couples navigating this pattern often advise looking past what is being promised entirely and looking instead at what has actually changed in the relationship over the past several months. The gap between those two things is where the truth of the situation usually lives. The future described so vividly was never actually a plan. It was a substitute for one, offered instead. A person who is quietly unfaithful accuses their partner, with real apparent conviction, of being untrustworthy and secretive. A person who struggles openly with honesty repeatedly questions whether others around them are lying. The accusation lands with unusual force, not because it is accurate, but because it is coming from exactly the person who would know that particular flaw best, having lived closest to it themselves. Projection, one of the oldest documented psychological defenses, describes the attribution of one's own unwanted trait, impulse, or behavior onto someone else, often without the person doing the projecting consciously recognizing what they are doing. The original concept comes from early clinical psychology, describing an unconscious defense against uncomfortable self-knowledge, but its everyday manipulative version does not require any deep unconscious process at all. Sometimes it is simply a convenient accusation deployed knowingly, precisely because it happens to land with extra credibility, coming from someone who understands the flaw intimately. What makes projection especially effective as a manipulation tactic is the secondary damage it causes. Once a person has loudly and convincingly accused someone else of a particular flaw, a later genuine accusation of that same flaw, made honestly by someone else, becomes much harder to take seriously. The projection does not just deflect blame in the moment, it poisons the well for any future accurate accusation as well. Distinguishing projection from a legitimate concern requires looking at evidence rather than conviction, since the confidence behind a projected accusation is often unusually strong, precisely because it is drawing on real, if misdirected, self-knowledge. The accusation described someone perfectly, it simply described the wrong person. A specific pointed criticism is raised in a conversation, and rather than addressing it directly, the person being criticized responds by pointing at an entirely unrelated flaw belonging to the person raising the criticism, or to some third party altogether. The original question sits unanswered, buried under a new argument about someone else's behavior instead. Whataboutism substitutes comparison for accountability, and it is effective because comparison genuinely does feel, in the moment, like a form of argument. Pointing out that someone else has done something equally bad or worse can feel like it settles the matter, even though it does absolutely nothing to address whether the original criticism was accurate. Two wrongs, logically, have never made a right, but rhetorically, introducing a second wrong is remarkably good at making an audience momentarily forget the first one was still unresolved. The tactic shows up constantly in political discourse, where it has become common enough to earn its specific name, but it appears just as often in personal relationships, workplace disputes, and casual arguments among friends. A partner confronted about being late instance of the other partner being late months earlier. A colleague confronted about a missed deadline might immediately point to a missed deadline, might immediately to a co-worker's own missed deadline instead of addressing their own. What makes whataboutism difficult to counter in real time is that refusing to engage with the comparison can look to an observer like avoiding a fair point, even though the comparison was never actually relevant to the original question in the first place. The question asked was never actually answered. It was simply outshouted by a different question entirely. Asked directly whether a specific promise was made, a person responds with a long, meandering answer touching on context, circumstances, and general intentions, at no point actually saying either yes or no. The listener walks away with the vague sense that something was addressed, without being able to say afterward what exactly the answer actually was. Strategic vagueness is a documented tactic for avoiding accountability while still appearing responsive. Unlike a flat refusal to answer, which draws immediate attention to the evasion, vague language creates the appearance of cooperation, of engagement, of a real attempt to respond, while leaving nothing concrete enough to hold the speaker to later. The speaker can address the question, technically true, while the listener is left holding an answer with no actual content in it. What distinguishes strategic vagueness from honest uncertainty is specificity about the uncertainty itself. A person who genuinely does not know an answer tends to say so plainly, and to be specific about exactly what is uncertain and why. Strategic vagueness, by contrast, tends to be fluent and confident in delivery, generous with words, and precisely evasive about the one detail that actually matters, which is usually a sign that the vagueness is a choice rather than a limitation. This tactic shows up in political interviews, corporate statements, and personal relationships alike. Wherever a direct answer would create accountability, the speaker would rather avoid. While total silence would create suspicion, the speaker also wants to avoid. The fog was never a failure to communicate. It was quite precisely the message. A salesperson presents a customer with two options: buy the expensive extended warranty, or accept full personal responsibility if the product breaks down. Presented this way, the warranty suddenly looks like the responsible choice, even though the actual range of real options, including simply not needing a warranty at all, was far wider than the two the salesperson chose to name. The false dichotomy reduces a genuinely complex decision to exactly two visible options, one of which is deliberately framed as clearly worse, in order to steer the listener toward the other without ever having to argue for it directly. The persuasive work happens entirely in the framing of the choice, before any actual reasoning about either option begins. This tactic appears constantly in political rhetoric, where complicated policy questions are frequently reduced to two starkly opposed camps, obscuring the far larger range of positions that exist between and around them. It appears in personal relationships too, when an ultimatum frames a decision as either accept everything on offer or lose the relationship entirely, hiding every intermediate possibility that might have existed between those two extremes. What makes false dichotomies effective is that identifying the missing middle requires a deliberate pause, a moment of stepping back to ask what other options exist beyond the two named. Most conversations move too quickly for that pause to happen naturally, which is precisely why the tactic is deployed inside fast-moving exchanges rather than in slower, more deliberate ones. The choice offered was never actually the full range of choices available. It was only ever the two someone else wanted considered. A shopper who has just donated to a charity display near a store's entrance is, moments later, measurably more likely to make a small unethical choice elsewhere in that same shopping trip than a shopper who walked past the same display without donating. The good deed, rather than reinforcing good behavior generally, appears to have licensed a bit of bad behavior right afterward. Moral licensing describes exactly this pattern, a visible, recent act of virtue functioning as a kind of moral currency that gets spent later on behavior the person would otherwise feel guilty about. Researchers studying this effect have documented it across a wide range of behaviors, from environmental choices to workplace honesty to personal spending, finding a consistent pattern in which recent good behavior predicts a subsequent lapse rather than a continued streak of virtue. The effect is exploited deliberately in some settings. A company might publicize a charitable initiative specifically to buy goodwill that offsets scrutiny of some other, less flattering practice. An individual might perform a visible act of generosity, specifically as insurance against criticism for an unrelated failing, consciously or not, banking on the good deed to soften how the failing gets judged. What separates this deliberate use of moral licensing from ordinary human inconsistency is intent and timing. An honest person who occasionally slips is simply imperfect. Someone who performs virtue specifically as a strategic down payment against future scrutiny is doing something closer to bookkeeping than to actual goodness. The good deed genuinely happened. What happened right after it happened is the part worth watching. A tightly knit committee, under pressure to reach a decision quickly and preserve a sense of unity, moves toward consensus with remarkable speed, and afterward, several individual members privately admit they had serious doubts they never raised in the room. No one lied, no one was silenced by force, and yet the group, as a whole, made a decision that almost none of its members would have made on their own. Groupthink was named to describe exactly this dynamic, a cohesive group prioritizing internal harmony, and the appearance of agreement over the harder, messier work of honest disagreement. The pressure to conform is rarely explicit. It is usually felt as a vague social discomfort, a reluctance to be the one dissenting voice, a sense that raising doubts would damage the group's morale or the dissenter's own standing within it. Anyone who benefits from a group reaching a particular conclusion can exploit groupthink deliberately, by emphasizing unity and urgency, by subtly signaling early which conclusion is favored before genuine deliberation has a chance to happen, or by framing dissent itself as disloyalty to the group. Once even a small early signal of the preferred conclusion is set, subsequent members are far less likely to voice a differing view, and the appearance of consensus builds on itself, each silent member reading the room's apparent agreement as confirmation that dissent would be unwelcome. What makes groupthink hard to interrupt from inside a room is that the mechanism relies on nobody speaking up first. It only takes one honest dissent to change what the whole room believes is possible to say. The agreement in that room was never as complete as it looked from anywhere inside it. A questionable practice inside a workplace, a family, or a community is defended not with evidence that it actually works, but with the simple observation that it has always been done this way, that it has been passed down for generations, that changing it now would be a kind of disrespect to everyone who came before. The appeal to tradition substitutes the age of a practice for evidence of its merit, and it is remarkably effective at shutting down further questioning, because challenging a long-standing practice can feel, socially, like challenging the people who upheld it, including people the listener may genuinely respect or love. This emotional weight has nothing to do with whether the practice itself actually produces good outcomes, but it operates as though it does. This tactic appears wherever change threatens an established arrangement that currently benefits someone. Institutions defend outdated procedures by invoking their long history rather than their current usefulness. Families maintain harmful patterns across generations, partly because questioning them feels like questioning the relatives who upheld them. Even everyday habits get defended this way, a practice continued simply because it has always been the practice, with no one quite able to say why it should continue beyond the fact that it already has. What distinguishes a legitimate respect for tradition from a manipulative appeal to it is whether the practice is ever actually evaluated on its own merits at all. A tradition worth keeping can usually survive being examined honestly. A tradition defended purely by its age, with no argument offered beyond how long it has persisted, is often being protected from exactly that examination. Something being old has never, on its own, made it good. A product marketed heavily around the words new and revolutionary sells briskly, even when its actual improvements over the previous version are minor or entirely cosmetic. The word new appears to be doing a substantial amount of the persuading on its own, independent of whatever the product actually does differently. The appeal to novelty is the mirror image of the appeal to tradition, trading on freshness rather than age, but relying on the exact same underlying substitution, a superficial quality standing in for actual evidence of merit. Just as something old is not automatically good simply because it has endured, something new is not automatically better simply because it has just arrived. Both appeals let a listener skip the harder work of evaluating a claim on its actual substance. Technology marketing leans on this appeal constantly, framing incremental updates as transformative leaps, betting correctly that the excitement of newness will outpace careful scrutiny of what has actually changed. Political and social movements sometimes lean on the same appeal in the opposite direction from tradition, framing an idea as inevitable and forward-thinking specifically because it is unfamiliar, without ever demonstrating that unfamiliar and better are the same thing. What distinguishes a legitimate excitement about genuine innovation from a manipulative appeal to novelty is, again, whether the underlying claim ever gets actually examined. A real improvement can typically demonstrate itself with evidence independent of how recently it arrived. An appeal to novelty alone offers nothing but the recency itself, dressed up to look like proof. Something being new has never, on its own, made it true. A disagreement between two people escalates rapidly, voices rising, accusations piling on top of each other faster than either person can respond to them, until one or both participants find themselves unable to think clearly at all, flooded by an intensity of emotion that has crowded out reasoned response entirely. Emotional flooding describes this specific physiological state in which the body stress response overwhelms the brain's capacity for calm, deliberate reasoning, leaving a person able to react, but not able to think through a considered response. Relationship researchers who study conflict have found that once flooding sets in, continuing an argument rarely produces anything productive, because at least one participant is no longer capable of the kind of clear thinking a resolution actually requires. What makes flooding relevant as a manipulation tactic, rather than simply an unfortunate accident of heated conflict, is that some people learn, deliberately or through habit, to escalate an argument specifically to induce flooding in the other person, recognizing that a flooded partner is easier to overwhelm into agreement, apology, or silence than a calm one would be. Rather than winning an argument through better reasoning, the goal becomes ending the argument by making calm reasoning impossible for the other side. What distinguishes deliberate flooding from an argument that simply got heated on its own is pattern and timing. Does the escalation reliably arrive right at the moment the other person makes a valid point? And does it reliably subside the moment the other person capitulates? If so, the flooding was serving a purpose beyond simply expressing genuine emotion. The argument was never actually won. The other side was simply made incapable of continuing it. During a disagreement, one partner goes completely quiet, offering no response at all, no argument, no acknowledgement, no visible reaction of any kind, while the other partner continues attempting to engage, met each time by the same flat, impenetrable wall of nothing. Stonewalling withdraws from conflict entirely rather than engaging with it, and while it can superficially resemble a calm, measured response, especially compared to shouting or flooding, relationship researchers have found it to be one of the most consistently corrosive patterns in long-term relationships, associated with declining satisfaction and trust over time. The calm appearance of stonewalling is deceptive. Internally, the person stonewalling is often just as physiologically activated as someone flooding, but rather than escalating outward, they shut down entirely. What distinguishes destructive stonewalling from a healthy, brief pause taken to avoid saying something regrettable in the heat of an argument is duration and communication. A healthy pause is typically named aloud, "I need a few minutes before we keep talking about this," and it has a clear intention to return to the conversation. Stonewalling, by contrast, often arrives with no explanation at all, persists far longer than genuine self-regulation requires, and can function as its own form of punishment, leaving the other partner without any path forward, unable to argue, unable to resolve, unable even to be acknowledged. Over repeated instances, a partner on the receiving end of habitual stonewalling often learns that raising concerns at all is pointless, since concerns raised are simply met with silence rather than engagement, which quietly discourages honest communication altogether. The wall never announced why it was built. It simply stood there indefinitely until the other person stopped knocking. A person in a new relationship gradually sees less of the friends they used to see often, not because of any single dramatic argument, but through a long accumulation of small discouragements. A partner who seems subtly hurt whenever plans with friends are made. A partner who questions the motives of specific friends just enough to plant doubt. A partner who is simply unavailable or upset whenever an outside visit is suggested. Isolation is one of the most consistently documented early warning signs identified by researchers studying coercive and abusive relationships, and it is effective precisely because it rarely announces itself clearly. No single instance of discouraged contact looks alarming on its own. A partner expressing mild jealousy or preferring quiet time together over a night out is common and often entirely benign. What distinguishes isolation as a tactic is the accumulation and direction of the pattern over time, a steady, one-way narrowing of the outside relationships available to a person, until the primary relationship becomes the only significant source of validation, information, and support left standing. This matters enormously because outside relationships function as a kind of reality check, other perspectives that can confirm or gently challenge what is happening inside a relationship. Once those outside perspectives are gone, a person becomes far more dependent on a single source for their entire sense of what is normal, reasonable, or true, which is precisely the position that makes every other tactic in this list easier to deploy without any outside voice ever noticing. The ties were never cut all at once. They were simply allowed to fray, one small discouragement at a time, until there was nothing left to notice the fraying. Someone attempting to provoke a strong reaction, an insult, an accusation, a deliberately unfair comparison, meets a response that is calm, brief, and almost boring, offering no visible anger, no defensiveness, no engagement with debate at all, just a flat, minimal acknowledgement before the conversation moves on. Grey rocking is a documented and often recommended counter-tactic against manipulation, particularly effective against people who seek an emotional reaction as a kind of fuel. Many of the tactics described throughout this list, negging, guilt-tripping, DARVO, deliberate flooding, depend on producing a visible emotional response in the target, since that response is either the actual goal, in the case of provocation for its own sake, or the necessary first step towards some further manipulation. A target who consistently declines to provide that reaction becomes, in a very practical sense, a poor source of whatever the manipulator was seeking. The technique gets its name from the idea of becoming as unremarkable and unreactive as a grey rock, offering the manipulator nothing interesting to engage with, no outrage to escalate, no hurt to exploit, no defensiveness to twist into further accusation. Unlike direct confrontation, which can invite further conflict, grey rocking simply declines to participate in the emotional exchange the other person is seeking, without necessarily declaring that intention out loud. Counselors who work with people navigating manipulative relationships sometimes recommend grey rocking specifically as a temporary safety strategy, useful for reducing conflict in situations where leaving is not immediately possible, though most also note it is a defensive measure rather than a long-term solution to an unhealthy dynamic. The flat voice gave nothing away, and that, this time, was exactly the point of it. Look back across everything in this list, and a shared architecture starts to emerge underneath the individual tactics. Almost none of them work well in one large, obvious dose. Reciprocity needs a gift small enough to seem harmless. Foot in the door needs a first request modest enough to be granted without much thought. Isolation needs to advance one quiet discouragement at a time. Moving goalposts needs each new demand to look small relative to the one just met, never large relative to where things actually started. This is the incremental architecture underneath nearly every tactic covered so far, an escalation so gradual that each individual step is judged only against the step immediately before it, never against the full distance already travelled. A request that would be refused instantly if it arrived on day 1 becomes almost unremarkable by the time it finally arrives on day 200, not because the request became more reasonable, but because the person being asked has been recalibrated, one small increment at a time to a new baseline of what counts as normal. This is sometimes described informally as a boiling frog pattern, drawn from an old and scientifically inaccurate story about a frog that fails to notice water slowly heating around it. The biology behind that particular story does not hold up, but the psychological pattern it was reaching for is real and well documented. Gradual change is dramatically harder to notice than sudden change, even when the eventual destination is identical either way. The defense against this pattern is not constant suspicion of every small request, which would make ordinary trust impossible. It is a periodic, deliberate comparison, not to where things stood yesterday, but to where they stood at the very beginning. Most of what has been asked of you was never large enough on its own to notice. It only ever needed to be asked one step at a time. There is a version of this list that ends with a warning, telling you to be on guard from now on, to treat every kind favour and every compliment with suspicion. That is not really the point of any of this, and it would make for a smaller, more fearful life than the one this channel is actually interested in helping you toward. Most gifts are simply gifts. Most compliments mean exactly what they say. Most silences are just people needing a minute to think. What changes once you can name 100 of these patterns clearly is not how much you trust people. It is how quickly you notice the specific moment when trust is being asked for on unusual terms, a favor with a hook already in it, a compliment arriving one breath before a request, a deadline that only ever seems to reset, a goalpost that has quietly moved again. That noticing does not require becoming colder or more guarded. It only requires having a name ready for the thing, so that in the moment it happens, some part of your attention is already awake to it, instead of caught entirely by surprise. A stranger can still get you to agree to something large by starting with something small. That fact has not changed by reading this far, and it never fully will, because the mechanism runs on instincts too old and too useful to switch off. What has changed is smaller than that, and quieter, but it tends to matter more over the long run than any single dramatic realization would. You now have 100 names for 100 small moments, and a name, once you have it, is very hard to fully unlearn. Settle back into your evening, or your walk, or whatever this was quietly keeping company through. The list is finished, but the noticing it leaves behind tends to keep going a good while longer on its own.